When a furious white CEO erupts over a spilled coffee, he sees an elderly black janitor with a mop weathered quiet and easy to intimidate. He hurls insults, certain the old man won't fight back. What he doesn't know is that Clarence Harris, 72, has spent decades honing resilience, carrying the weight of a lifetime of slights with unyielding dignity. He warns the CEO to stop. The man sneers. Moments later, Clarence's calm defiance exposes a crack in the CEO's polished facade, captured on a smartphone by a stunned employee. The video spreads like wildfire across the internet, but the real fight is just beginning. Now threats loom, and Clarence isn't backing down, he's ready to strike back. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're reading from. And stay tuned, because tomorrow's chapter is one you won't want to miss. The marble lobby of Carson Enterprises shimmered under the fluorescent lights, its polished floors reflecting the slow, steady strokes of Clarence Harris's mop. At 72, his wiry frame moved with practiced ease, his gray janitor's uniform faded from years of late-night shifts. For 15 years, he'd cleaned this glass and steel fortress, invisible to the executives who hurried past, their eyes glued to their phones or their ambitions. Clarence had mastered invisibility long ago, a survival skill learned in a world where a black man's presence could be a threat. Tonight, though, the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Raised voices sliced through the quiet from the glass-walled conference room across the lobby. Clarence's mop slowed as he glanced at the partially open blinds. Richard Carson, the company's CEO, loomed in his tailored navy suit, his blonde hair catching the city's neon glow through the windows. His gestures were sharp, his voice a low growl as he argued with Thomas Reed, a senior executive whose reserved demeanor hid a quiet intensity. A leather briefcase sat between them on the table, its presence heavy, almost menacing. "Keep it down," Thomas hissed his words, slipping through the cracked door. "Not here." Clarence edged closer to the water fountain, pretending to polish its chrome surface, his heart thudding with instinct. He wasn't supposed to hear this. "You think you can threaten me?" Richard's voice cut through barely a whisper, but laced with venom. "I built this company. I own every brick, every soul in it. You're nothing but a—" The conference room door flew open, and Clarence's hand brushed a paper coffee cup left on the fountain's edge. It tipped, splashing dark liquid across Richard's crisp white shirt and suit jacket. The lobby fell silent, the air thick with tension. A handful of late-shift employees froze near the elevators, their eyes darting between Clarence and the CEO. Richard stared at the stain spreading across his chest, then lifted his gaze to Clarence. His face, usually camera-ready for board meetings, twisted into raw contempt. "You useless old fool," Richard snarled, stepping closer, his polished shoes clicking on the marble. Clarence gripped his mop handle, his knuckles tightening. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carson," he said, his voice low but steady, honed by years of keeping calm under pressure. "It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning." Pay? Richard's laugh was sharp, a blade meant to cut. He turned to the small crowd, his voice rising for effect. "Look at this, folks. The kind of help we're forced to keep around. A relic mopping floors with slaves' hands, too stupid to even do that right." The words landed like a fist, each syllable dripping with the kind of racism Clarence had faced all his life, sometimes subtle, sometimes as bold as this. The employees stood frozen, some looking away, others clutching their briefcases. One young woman, her phone already out, discreetly tapped record, her hands trembling. "Mr. Carson," Clarence said, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. "I've worked here 15 years. I do my job well." 15 years too long, Richard spat, closing the distance until he was inches from Clarence's face. 15 years of charity cases like you dragging down my company? Affirmative action trash. He snapped his fingers toward the security desk. Get him out of my sight. That's not necessary, a quiet voice cut in. Thomas Reed stepped forward, his graying temples catching the light, his eyes holding a flicker of defiance. Mr. Harris was doing his work. The spill was my fault. I bumped his arm. Richard's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. Thomas, stay out of this. The company's insurance will cover your shirt, Thomas said, ignoring Richard's glare. Mr. Harris, please continue your duties. Mr. Carson and I have matters to discuss. Clarence nodded, his hands steadying on the mop handle. As he turned toward the service elevator, Thomas slipped a folded piece of paper into his palm with a practiced, almost imperceptible motion. Their eyes met for a split second, a warning passing between them. This isn't over, Richard growled as Clarence pushed his cart toward the elevator. Nothing ends until I say it does. The doors slid shut, and Clarence's breath caught. In the dim light of the elevator, he unfolded the note. You saw nothing. Be careful. The scrawled words carried a weight that made his chest tighten. In his small apartment, Clarence hung his coat on its usual hook, the note tucked into his pocket like a live wire. He sank into his worn armchair, pulling his father's old Bible from the side table. Its pages, marked with decades of underlined verses, felt like an anchor. He slipped the note inside Psalm 23, his fingers lingering on the worn leather. Richard's words, slave's hands charity case, burned in his mind, but so did the image of that briefcase, the heated argument, and Thomas's warning. Clarence had spent his life navigating men like Richard, men who saw his skin before his humanity. But tonight, he'd seen something they didn't want him to see. And that video, now spreading online, meant the world was watching too. He dialed his son Daniel's number, his voice calm but resolute. Son, he said, when Daniel answered alert, despite the hour. Something happened tonight at work. Something big. And I think it's just the start. Clarence Harris sat in his worn armchair, the dim glow of a single lamp casting shadows across his modest apartment. The city's hum drifted through the cracked window, but inside the air was heavy with the weight of the night's events. His father's Bible lay open on his lap, the note from Thomas Reed tucked inside Psalm 23. You saw nothing. Be careful. The words scrawled in hurried ink felt like a pulse under his fingertips. Richard Carson's voice still echoed in his mind, slave's hands, charity case, each syllable a fresh wound on a lifetime of scars. But beneath the sting, a fire kindled. Clarence had endured decades of being unseen, dismissed, and diminished. Tonight, he'd seen something Richard didn't want seen, and that viral video of the CEO's racist tirade was spreading faster than Clarence could have imagined. His old rotary phone sat on the side table, its cord tangled from years of use. He dialed Daniel, his son, knowing the late hour wouldn't matter. Daniel answered on the first ring, his voice sharp with concern. Dad, what's wrong? A civil rights lawyer with a fire? Clarence recognized from his own youth, Daniel could always sense trouble. I'm okay, son, Clarence said, though his voice cracked slightly. But something happened at work. Richard Carson lost it, called me things in front of everyone. And I saw something I wasn't supposed to. He recounted the night, the spilled coffee, Richard's venomous outburst, the silent employees, and the young woman's phone capturing it all. Then the briefcase exchange between Richard and Thomas Reed, their heated whispers, and the note now hidden in his Bible. He said, I had slaves' hands. Daniel Clarence said, his voice low. Right there in the lobby, like I was nothing. But that briefcase, something's not right. Daniel's end of the line went quiet. Then came the sound of him pacing a habit when his mind was racing. Dad, that video's already online. It's blowing up. Carson racist is trending. But this note, this meeting, it sounds like Carson's hiding something big. We need to move fast. Clarence glanced at the Bible, his fingers tracing its worn edges. I don't want trouble, son. I need this job. His voice carried the weight of years spent swallowing pride to keep food on the table to send Daniel to law school. You're not causing trouble, Daniel said fiercely. Carson did that when he humiliated you, and whatever he's hiding, he brought that on himself. I'm calling Laura Mitchell, the board chairwoman. She's been sniffing around Carson's deals for months. Clarence heard rapid typing. Then Daniel's voice softened. You sure you're okay, Dad? I'm tired. Clarence admitted his gaze drifting to a framed photo of his late wife Ella, smiling at Daniel's graduation. Tired of being invisible, of taking it because I have to. But I'm not broken. Daniel's voice steadied. You're the strongest man I know. I'm sending Laura an email now. She'll want to hear about the harassment and what you saw. Almost instantly, Daniel's phone buzzed. Hold on, Dad. Laura's calling back. Clarence listened to Daniel's side of the conversation, catching phrases like hostile workplace and witnessed exchange. His small living room felt too quiet, too exposed. He rose to check the door's lock, an old habit from growing up in a neighborhood where safety wasn't guaranteed. Laura's calling an emergency board meeting, Daniel said, returning to the call. She says Carson's outburst gives her leverage to suspend him pending investigation. There have been financial irregularities they've been tracking. This could be the break they need. Clarence sank back into his chair, relief mixing with unease. Just like that? He asked. Not quite, Daniel said. But Laura's different. She cares about the company's people, not just its profits. She's pushing for a vote by morning. Clarence nodded, though Daniel couldn't see. The video, the note, the briefcase, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he'd stumbled into. But before he could say more, a faint scent caught his attention. Cologne sharp and unfamiliar, lingering in the air. His heart quickened. He moved to the kitchen, where cabinet doors stood slightly ajar. In his bedroom, a dresser drawer wasn't fully closed. Someone had been here. Daniel, he said, his voice low. Someone's been in my apartment. He checked his closet, his spare work uniform, and Carson Enterprises' ID were gone. They took my uniform and badge. Daniel's voice hardened. Don't touch anything else, Dad. Call 911. I'm coming over now. Clarence hung up his hands, trembling as he dialed the police. He returned to his armchair. The Bible still open, the note untouched. Whoever had broken in hadn't found it, but they'd sent a message. Richard Carson's reach was long and his anger was personal. 15 minutes later, Daniel burst through the door, still in his suit from a late meeting. 2 police officers followed their flashlights, sweeping the small space. Officer Patel, a young woman with a notepad, knelt beside Clarence. "What's missing, Mr. Harris?" she asked. "My work uniform and ID," Clarence said, then hesitated. He didn't mention the note, not yet. It felt too dangerous, too tied to whatever Richard was hiding. Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't a random break-in. Nothing valuable's gone, no TV, no cash. It's intimidation tied to what happened tonight. Officer Patel nodded, scribbling. No forced entry. They had a key or picked the lock clean. "We'll increase patrols, Mr. Harris." As the officers left, Daniel turned to Clarence. "You're staying with me tonight, Dad." Clarence shook his head, his voice firm. "This is my home. I won't let them scare me out." Daniel's eyes softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "Then I'm staying here. And tomorrow we fight back." Clarence looked at his son, seeing Ella's fire in his face. He'd raised a warrior, but tonight something shifted in Clarence too. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a man who'd seen the truth, and he wasn't going to stay invisible. The fluorescent lights of Daniel Harris's office at the Justice Forward Foundation buzzed softly, casting a stark glow over the cluttered desk where he and Frank Sullivan pored over financial records. Frank, a retired investigator with a weathered face and a leather jacket that had seen better days, traced a finger across a spreadsheet, his eyes narrowing. "Carson's been bleeding this company dry for years," he muttered, circling a line item for a non-existent vendor. Fake contracts, offshore accounts, pension funds siphoned off. It's a house of cards. Daniel, his tie loosened after a sleepless night, leaned forward, his jaw tight. "And he's using it to crush people like my dad." Clarence sat quietly in the corner, his hands folded around a chipped coffee mug, the weight of the previous night's break-in still heavy on his shoulders. The stolen uniform and ID, the faint scent of cologne in his apartment, it all pointed to Richard Carson's long reach. But the note from Thomas Reed, still hidden in his Bible at home, burned in his mind. "You saw nothing. Be careful." Clarence had spent decades navigating racism's sharp edges, snide comments, closed doors, opportunities denied. But this was different. Richard's public humiliation caught on that viral video had exposed more than his hatred. It had pulled Clarence into a dangerous game. And he wasn't backing down. "Dad," Daniel said, glancing over, "you don't have to be here. This is getting risky." Clarence shook his head, his voice steady. "I've been invisible my whole life, son. If I don't stand up now, who will?" Frank looked up, his grizzled face softening with respect. "Your dad's right. The invisible ones see everything. That's why Carson's scared." He tapped the spreadsheet. "These records show he's been targeting minority contractors, driving them out of business, then buying their assets cheap. Classic predatory playbook covered up with payoffs to regulators." Daniel's phone buzzed with a news alert. Carson racist was still trending, but now counter-narratives were creeping in, smearing Clarence as a disgruntled employee and Daniel as a radical activist. Richard's PR machine was moving fast. "He's trying to bury the story," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We need hard evidence, something they can't spin." Frank nodded, pulling out a worn notepad. "There's an old server room in Carson Enterprises' basement, abandoned years ago. I stashed a drive there with backups, financials, emails, proof of Carson's payoffs. Nobody looks at the janitorial wing right." Clarence's eyes lit with recognition. "B7 storage behind the electrical panel. I've cleaned that floor for 15 years. Nobody goes there except us cleaners." His mind raced. He knew every blind spot in that building, every hallway the cameras didn't reach. "I can get in," he said, standing. Daniel's head snapped up. "Dad, no. It's too dangerous after the break-in." But Clarence's resolve was iron. "They think I'm nothing. That's my advantage." That night, Clarence slipped into Carson Enterprises through the service entrance, his spare key kept hidden at home, safe from the break-in, clicking softly in the lock. His soft-soled shoes, worn from years of quiet work, made no sound on the polished basement floors. The air smelled of bleach and musty concrete, familiar as his own heartbeat. He wore a borrowed uniform from his friend Jerome, the day-shift janitor, to blend in. The building was quiet, but the weight of Richard's threat hung heavy. Clarence moved toward the janitorial office in B7, his pulse quickening as voices drifted from behind the half-closed door. He recognized Brad Thompson, Richard's head of security, and Maria Valdez, the HR director, who always sided with management. "We've got his uniform and ID," Brad said, his voice low. "Plant the documents in his locker tomorrow. Make it look like he's been stealing trade secrets. The feds will get an anonymous tip by noon." Maria hesitated. "This feels extreme, Brad. He's just an old janitor." Brad's laugh was harsh. "Carson says he needs to learn his place. Nobody crosses him, especially not some black nobody with a mop. Clarence's fingers tightened on his phone, the recording app Daniel had installed already running. He pressed it closer to the door's gap, capturing every word. "What about the son?" Maria asked. "Daniel's foundation is next," Brad replied. "We've got forged financials ready to leak money laundering through his nonprofit. Carson's got IRS contacts waiting to pounce." Clarence's jaw clenched. They weren't just coming for him, they wanted to destroy everything Daniel had built. A door slammed down the hall, and footsteps echoed. "Security sweep," a voice called. Clarence's heart pounded. He slipped into a nearby storage closet, the chemical smell of ammonia stinging his nose. The cramped space was tight shelves pressing against his back as he held his breath. Flashlight beams swept the corridor, pausing outside the janitorial office. "All clear," the guard reported after a tense minute. Clarence waited, counting seconds like he used to during hide-and-seek with Daniel as a boy. When silence returned, he checked his phone. The recording was intact. He crept back to the service entrance, the night guard dozing as expected. Outside, the cold air hit his face, but his hands were steady as he texted Daniel. "Got proof. They're framing us both. Ready to fight." As he boarded the night bus, Clarence felt a shift inside him. For 15 years, he'd lowered his eyes, swallowed his pride, stayed silent. Not anymore. The recording in his pocket was a weapon proof that Richard Carson's empire was built on lies and fear. And Clarence Harris, the nobody with a mop, was about to show him just how wrong he'd been. The morning sun barely pierced the gray haze over the city, but inside Daniel Harris's office at the Justice Forward Foundation, the atmosphere crackled with urgency. Laptops glowed with damning evidence, Clarence's recording from the janitorial office financial records from Frank Sullivan's hidden server, and a grainy photo of a young Richard Carson standing beside a black woman in a nurse's uniform. Daniel, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, paced as his team prepared for a prime-time press conference. "This is it," he said, pointing to the photo on his screen. "Richard's mother, Clara Thompson. He's spent his life erasing her passing as white to build his empire." Clarence sat in the corner, his hands folded around his father's Bible, the note from Thomas Reed still tucked inside. The viral video of Richard's racist outburst calling Clarence a relic with slaves' hands had ignited a firestorm, but Richard's counterattack was swift and vicious. News alerts flooded Daniel's phone-doctored audio of him supposedly threatening to burn Carson Enterprises to the ground, leaked juvenile records from when he was 16, long expunged, and headlines branding Clarence a manipulated pawn in a corporate sabotage plot. Richard's PR machine painted them as criminals, flooding social media with racist vitriol. Carson Innocent trended alongside slurs aimed at Clarence and Daniel. "They're trying to bury us," Daniel muttered, slamming his phone down. "Just like they've always done to our people when we speak up." Clarence's voice was quiet, but firm. "They can't bury the truth, son. Not this time." Frank Sullivan, still bruised from the car crash, orchestrated by Richard's enforcers, limped into the room, his leather jacket scuffed, but his eyes sharp. "I've got more," he said, sliding a USB drive across the desk. Emails from Carson to a federal judge arranging payoffs to dismiss lawsuits from minority contractors. And this, he tapped the photo of Clara Thompson. Thomas Reed sent it. He's ready to talk. Clarence's gaze locked on the image. Clara's eyes, proud and kind, mirrored his own mother's. "Thomas is Richard's half-brother." Frank continued. "Same mother, different fathers. Richard's been hiding his black heritage, crushing anyone who reminds him of it, like you, Clarence." The phone rang, and Daniel put it on speaker. Laura Mitchell Carson Enterprises board chairwoman spoke crisply. The networks are giving you 8 p.m. Eastern live broadcast. The recording of Carson's team planning to frame you is explosive. They can't ignore it. Clarence stood, his voice resolute. I'm speaking tonight. Clara's story needs to be told by someone who's lived invisible, someone who knows what it's like to be erased. Daniel hesitated, then nodded, seeing the fire in his father's eyes. As evening approached, Daniel's security chief burst in. Carson's hired ex-military types, 3 black SUVs parked at key intersections to the studio. They know about the evidence. Laura's voice crackled through the phone. I've got federal agents on standby coordinated with the FBI's fraud unit. They'll escort you with helicopter surveillance. Carson's not the only one with connections. Clarence smoothed his simple gray suit chosen for tonight's battle. No decoys, no hiding, he said. Let them see us coming. At 7:45 p.m., Clarence, Daniel, and Thomas Reed stepped into an armored van flanked by unmarked FBI vehicles. Thomas Gaunt, from illness, clutched a briefcase filled with documents, birth certificates, DNA tests, and records of Richard's payoffs to erase his past. Clara raised us alone. Thomas said, his voice heavy. Richard was light-skinned like his father. He chose to pass to deny her. Every time he saw you, Clarence, it was like seeing her, and he hated it. Clarence nodded, thinking of Richard's venom, the slave's hand's taunt. It wasn't just racism, it was self-hatred turned outward. The studio lights blazed as Clarence stepped onto the stage, his sensible shoes silent on the polished floor. Millions watched through cameras, the audience hushed. He placed Clara Thompson's photo beside the microphone, her proud face facing the world. Good evening, Clarence, began his voice steady. I'm Clarence Harris, a janitor at Carson Enterprises for 15 years. Invisible work, they call it. But there's no such thing as invisible people, only those who refuse to see. The crowd leaned in, captivated. Last week, Richard Carson saw me. He called me a relic with slaves' hands in front of witnesses. But this isn't about one man's words. It's about a deeper poison self-hatred that destroys everyone it touches. Thomas joined him, his frail frame steady with purpose. Clara Thompson was my mother and Richard Carson's, he said, his voice cracking. A black woman who worked 3 jobs to give us a future. Richard erased her to build his empire, crushing anyone who reminded him of her truth. Screens lit up with documents, Clara's birth certificate, Richard's school records, financial trails of his crimes. The audience gasped as emails showed payoffs to silence minority workers. He targeted people like Clarence Thomas said, because they held a mirror to what he despised in himself. Outside commotion erupted. Richard's hired security tried to block the studio's entrances, their SUVs converging. But FBI agents alerted by Laura swarmed the perimeter, their radios crackling. Inside, Clarence continued, his voice rising. Truth doesn't stay buried. Dignity can't be taken if you hold it tight. The broadcast cut to breaking news. Federal agents raiding Richard's penthouse, his face ashen as he was cuffed. The audience erupted in murmurs, cameras flashing. Clarence stood tall, Clara's photo beside him, a testament to the truth that had brought a titan down. The federal courthouse stood like a sentinel under the morning sun, its tall windows casting golden light across the polished floors, where Clarence Harris sat in the front row. His hands, calloused from decades of mopping, rested calmly in his lap, his gray suit pressed with care by Daniel the night before. Across the courtroom, Richard Carson sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of the polished CEO who'd once humiliated Clarence. His prison orange jumpsuit hung loose, his blonde hair unkempt, his eyes darting nervously in a face aged by a month in detention. The viral video of his racist outburst calling Clarence a relic with slaves' hands had shattered his facade, and the evidence from Thomas Reed's briefcase had exposed his empire of fraud and self-hatred. Today, justice would speak. Judge Elena Martinez adjusted her glasses, her voice commanding the packed courtroom. In the matter of the United States versus Richard Carson, we are here for sentencing. Reporters in the back rows hushed, pencils poised. Clarence's gaze drifted to the framed photo of Clara Thompson, Richard's black mother, which he'd brought to the stand, a quiet reminder of the truth that had brought them here. Frank Sullivan, still in a wheelchair from the car crash, orchestrated by Richard's enforcers, testified first, his voice steady despite his injuries. "I saw the black SUV tailing me," he said, gripping the armrests. "No plates, professional hit. They ran me off the road after I found Carson's offshore accounts, millions stolen from workers' pensions." Richard stared at the table, avoiding Frank's gaze. Laura Mitchell, Carson Enterprises board chairwoman, took the stand next, her navy suit crisp, but her expression tight with anger. "Carson deceived the board for years," she said. "Shell companies, fake vendors, payoffs to silence minority employees. When we started investigating, he threatened our families." The screens displayed Thomas Reed's deposition, his frail voice detailing decades of Richard's crimes, targeting minority contractors, bribing judges, erasing his black heritage to climb the corporate ladder. Clarence watched Richard flinch as Clara's photo appeared, her proud eyes, a mirror he couldn't escape. When Clarence's turn came, he walked to the stand with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through 15 years of cleaning Carson Enterprises floors. "I saw things over the years," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Little cruelties, big cover-ups. But that night, when Mr. Carson called me a relic with slaves' hands, he showed his true face, not just to me, but to the world." He looked at Richard, not with anger, but with a pity that cut deeper. "He hated me because I reminded him of his mother, of the truth he buried. That hatred poisoned everything he built." Judge Martinez called Richard to stand. He rose slowly, his shoulders slumped, aged beyond his years. "Richard Carson," she began, "your actions represent a betrayal of trust, corporate fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, and systemic discrimination. You used your power to harm those you deemed beneath you, rooted in a denial of your own heritage." The sentence fell like a gavel: 40 years in federal prison, no parole for 25 years, $150 million in restitution to victims. Richard swayed silent as bailiffs cuffed him. Furthermore, the judge continued, "Carson Enterprises will undergo independent oversight for 5 years. All implicated board members must resign immediately." Laura stood addressing the court. "Your Honor, Carson Enterprises is restructuring. We've established a $40 million fund for minority employee advancement and education." She turned to Clarence. "And we formally apologize to Mr. Harris, whose courage exposed this corruption and changed our company forever." Cameras flashed as Laura approached Clarence, extending her hand. "Mr. Harris, on behalf of Carson Enterprises, I'm sorry for the discrimination you endured." Clarence accepted with a nod, his simple "thank you" carrying the weight of decades. As Richard was led away, a woman from the Urban Justice Coalition approached Clarence holding a crystal award. "Mr. Harris," she said, "cameras rolling for your bravery in confronting corporate corruption and sparking a national conversation about workplace dignity, we present you with our Community Leadership Award." Clarence held the award, its facets catching the sunlight. He thought of the nights he'd cleaned this courthouse invisible to the judges and lawyers. Now his name would be etched in its history as a man who brought justice to its halls. Spring sunlight bathed Clarence's new backyard, a modest single-story home in a quiet neighborhood he'd never dreamed of owning. Garden boxes lined the fence, sprouting vegetables his retirement project. The smell of barbecue smoke mingled with laughter as friends and family gathered. Jerome, his old co-worker, manned the grill in a kiss-the-cook apron, calling Mr. Clarence burgers are ready. Dorothy and May, former janitors now promoted to shift supervisors under Laura's reforms, chatted about their new roles, their grandchildren chasing each other across the lawn. Daniel Ty loosened, poured lemonade for Clarence. "You look happy, Dad," he said, his dark circles fading. Clarence smiled, glancing at a framed photo of his late wife Ella on the patio table. "I'm free, son." "That's enough." Frank Sullivan, his cast now signed with colorful marker, told stories to a group of teenagers, children of workers Richard had targeted. Laura arrived with a peach cobbler, joking, "Don't expect it to taste like my grandmother's." Thomas Reed's widow Angela shared photos of Clara Thompson, her voice soft. She'd be proud of this people coming together, no more hiding. Michael clinked his glass, the crowd quieting. "We're here to celebrate my father's new home," he began, but also something bigger. Laura stepped forward. "Carson Enterprises is partnering with the Justice Forward Foundation on Project Legacy, launching next month to protect elderly and marginalized workers nationwide." Daniel grinned. "Legal aid advocacy boards, education on workplace dignity. No more invisible labor." He looked at Clarence. "And we'd like Mr. Harris to cut the ribbon at our first advocacy center." Applause erupted. Clarence rose, overwhelmed, his gaze falling on his old uniform framed on the patio wall beside his award, a symbol of pride, not shame. The setting sun painted the sky in gold, and Clarence stood tall, his heart full. He'd been invisible once, but now the world saw him. And through him, they saw Clara Thompson, whose truth had toppled an empire of lies.